these times during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information. On behalf of Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to the Jaipur Literature Festival Digital Series season for 2021. Given the second wave of COVID-19 that has been at the heart of so much pain and suffering, we wish to continue with our vision to ensure the free flow of knowledge and information to address vital questions of our times. Our session today is Neither Settler nor Native, Mahmood Mamdani in conversation with Pardis Mahdavi. Academic and writer Mahmood Mamdani's recent book, Neither Settler nor Native, is a genealogy of political modernity based on the idea of the colonial state and nation state being a byproduct of each other. Steeped in research and case studies, the book unravels the need to reimagine political communities beyond the concept of majorities and minorities. Conversation with Pardis Mahdavi, Mamdani explores the origins and development of the nation state and the path to a reimagined and decolonized future. Mahmood Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government and Professor of Anthropology and Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, and is the director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala. He is the author of Neither Settler nor Native, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, Citizen and Subject, and When Victims Become Killers. Pardis Mahdavi is currently Dean of Social Sciences and Director of the School for Social Transformation at Arizona State University. Her research interests include gendered labor, human trafficking, migration, sexuality, human rights, transnational feminism, and public health in the context of changing global and political structures. To remember that all our sessions that have been broadcast till now and from all our festivals are available and archived on this site at the Mughal Tent venue, and of course also available on our Facebook page, Jaipur Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, JPR Litfest. Ladies and gentlemen, Neither Settler nor Native, Mahmood Mamdani in conversation with Pardis Mahdavi. Pardis, Mahmood, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sanjoy. What an honor and pleasure it is to be here again with the Jaipur Literature family, really. And delighted to be able to have an opportunity to be in conversation with my former professor. So this is a really special treat for us. Professor Mamdani, we're just going to jump right in here. I have several questions. As you know, love your work, loved the book. Very eager to hear some more of your thoughts on the book. So my first question, your long legacy of inspiring work has always tackled audacious and capacious questions. You've not shied away from the difficult subjects like in Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, Saviors or Survivors, and your work on political violence, memory, and the war on terror. But I might venture to say that this is your most audacious thesis yet, that nationalism and colonialism are two sides of the same coin, and that the nation state and colonial state have been mutually constructed through the politicization of an ethnic or religious majority at the expense of an equally manufactured minority. Can you tell us a little bit how you came to this particular topic and how your previous work led you to this journey?
Thank you, Pardis. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, everybody else behind the camera who I cannot see on the screen. Well, when I first began writing, it was as a career move. You had to write to get a job. You had to write to get a promotion. And then once I had gotten my job, and once I wasn't looking for a promotion, and the world outside began to impress on me, I realized in retrospect that my writing strategy changed. It changed in a way that I began to write every book as if it was the last book I was writing, as if I would not be writing anything after that. And what that meant was that I really didn't care of what people would think of the book, of what kind of reception it would get. But what I really cared about were the questions in my mind. Now, of course, I have been working on the question of extreme violence for quite some time. Ever since I wrote Citizen and Subject, and then I wrote a book on the genocide in Rwanda, and then a book on Darfur, Sudan, some of the titles you've mentioned anyway, but I've been working on that. So that was the continuity with my previous work. And I've also been very dissatisfied with the legacy of how the powers that be have tended to deal with extreme violence as some kind of an act of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, but an accumulation of individual acts. And this was typified in the Nuremberg trials. When I worked on South Africa, I realized that here before me was a different kind of paradigm, which did not really point to the courts as the solution for extreme violence, but pointed to politics and political reform. Then, of course, I mean, some of the stuff in the book is material I've worked on before. Some material is entirely new. And I began to, I mean, I was interested in South Africa. I wanted South Africa to be the kind of, to inform my perspective on this question. And that led me to ask questions like, where did the South African model come from? And led me to look at the US. And then finally, I would say, I also wanted to look at not questions which have been, in brackets, solved, but also questions which defy a solution, and which was really Israel-Palestine. And I said I would write a concluding chapter which would look at Israel-Palestine through South African lenses. How differently would we understand the Israel-Palestine problem and the way out of it if we looked at it through the South African lenses? That's a long answer to your very short question.
Oh, you've taken us on a wonderful journey of the book, which is terrific. As you mentioned, you begin in North America, in the United States, right? Pointing to US colonialism of indigenous peoples. I live in Arizona, a state that was considered pivotal in delivering the White House to the Democrats in this most recent election. That victory was interpreted as being largely due to the participation of Native American peoples in Arizona. And that interpretation in the media was that indigenous peoples spoke up and out against their suffering by voting. But you offer a possibly different interpretation. Your book notes that if we're thinking about the Arizona case and the participation of indigenous peoples, this wasn't so much a victory at all as you point out, the United States has been an innovator in creating permanent minorities, right? So as your book makes clear, there's been a long history of suffering experienced by indigenous peoples in North America, and they've been systematically excluded in the colonial project. So can you talk a little bit more about how we might interpret what we saw in Arizona and the sort of how we might challenge the classic media interpretation that, well, indigenous peoples were voting because they had had enough and they wanted to bring the Democrats into the White House? I take your work as taking us into a slightly different interpretation. I'm wondering if you can share that with us.
Thank you. Well, the U.S. is the originator of what we may today call the two-state solution, which really meant starting with the time that Lincoln generalized the reservation all across the US in the mid-19th century. Starting from that time, in fact, even before that, but confirmed at that time, American Indians were not part of the polity we call the United States. They were outside that polity. They were part of another state which functioned in tutelage, in a relationship of tutelage with the US, a state which had its internal autonomy and its tribal government, but which was supervised by a massive federal bureaucracy. And this state functioned, or the population, inhabitants of this state, functioned as wards of US Congress. So you put all of that together, and that basically gives you the structure of indirect rule colonialism in any African colony in the 20th century. The situation began to change with emigration of Native Americans outside the reservation into the main body of the US. But there was one condition for that emigration. The condition was that those leaving the reservation must at the same time renounce their right to land in the reservation. They must not partake in the collective nature of the ownership of that land, but must take an individual share, whatever they do with it. But they leave the reservation permanently. That's one change which took place. So these Native Americans who left became a part of the American polity as individuals, no longer as Native Americans as a collective identity. Second change which took place was that Native Americans within the reservations became citizens of the US. Now, another American contribution was to introduce different levels of citizenship, citizens with different rights. So the highest rank of citizens were white Americans, and then you could come down to other ranks of citizens, American Indians, African Americans, Puerto Ricans, etc., etc. I should just say in passing that Hitler was fascinated by this, and Hitler actually set up a committee to study American citizenship laws, and it is this committee which framed the Nuremberg Laws, which applied to Jews, which is that Jewish citizens in Germany would not be full citizens. They would be somewhere along the ladder of citizenship, following the American model. So with this American model, 1930s and on, American Indians could vote, but they still remained wards of Congress. They still remained those who living in reservations, subject to this federal bureaucracy. So you had this very peculiar situation. And that situation was reproduced by the Israelis in Israel-Palestine for the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So actually you mentioned Nuremberg and you mentioned Hitler. And I think one of the parts of the book that resonated so strongly for me was the part where you reject the criminal process that was used in Nuremberg, where individuals or individual perpetrators, essentially, you know, this is a very classic trope of, you know, blaming something on individual moral failings. This is sort of what I see in human trafficking work, as opposed to understanding this as a larger evidence of larger structural and systemic violence. So in your book, you know, you point out, rather than question Nazism as a political project, and by extension, the nation state, Nazis as individuals rather than Nazism is on trial. And so you state that political violence demands political solutions. What does that look like for you? What does that look like? I mean, should we be doing differently? And this, of course, applies to truth and reconciliation committees, as you rightly point out, restorative justice. But you know, when you say political violence demands political solutions, you know, as we think about, even we saw this in the war on terror. I see this in the war on trafficking. The war on trafficking is the hyper feminine antidote to the hyper masculine war on terror, right? And so you see this again, this sort of, okay, individual moral failings are the cause of all of this. How do we look at a political solution to underscore that this is systemic and political violence?
I think we begin with the nature of extreme violence. Extreme violence is not a standalone one-time act. Extreme violence is reproduced over a period of time. So once you recognize that it is reproduced and that you cannot explain that reproduction just by looking at individual perpetrators, you have to ask yourself what stands behind individual perpetrators. You have to shift attention from perpetrators to constituencies. And in order to shift attention to constituencies, you have to look at issues, not the question of individual gain, but the issues that drive these constituencies, issues behind which the constituencies stand. So that's one question. You're already beginning to move away from the individual. Second question is, by definition, the state cannot commit crime. Crime is against the state. Now, every situation I have looked at of extreme violence, the state has been at the center of it. You cannot understand that violence without looking at the violence either perpetrated by the state or enabled by the state through a whole set of regulations that the state helps to reproduce. When I was working on apartheid and South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I mean, I realized that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was just focusing on individual state agents to the extent they exceeded their orders, but not on them to the extent that they functioned within these orders, because to do so would then be to shift the light on the orders themselves. Would be to shift the light on the violence enabled by the state. Now, this was the difference, of course, between the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the political negotiations that began between political parties. Even though the political negotiations, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, were not interested in apportioning blame and in holding individuals accountable. The political process focused on issues, focused on constituencies, focused on the nature of the political community, on what was wanting, what were the limitations of these communities, who was included, who was empowered, who was excluded, who was disenfranchised. So that's the second point. The third point, of course, was that with the criminal process, what happens is that the criminal is disenfranchised politically. And what the South African example shows us is that if you disenfranchise the criminal and the constituencies that stand behind the criminal politically, then you can give up any possibility of an enduring solution, unless you are going to create two states, unless you're going to have a partition. If you're going to have a partition, a white state as opposed to a black state, or as Gaddafi once proposed in Rwanda, a Hutu state as opposed to a Tutsi state. If you're going to have a partition, the criminal method might work. But if you're not going to have a partition, if your object is to reform the state, if your object is to bring in something new, something which is inclusive, then you can't exclude criminals or constituencies that back them up. You have to give them another opportunity. So I put these things together in my consideration of, in my critique of Nuremberg, and in the call for a political solution, which also means, I might add one last thing, which also means that you shift your focus away from victims for a number of reasons. There is no victim's justice without a victory. Victim's justice is just the flip side of victor's justice. Victors stand behind victim's justice. They put themselves up as upholders of the justice that must be due to victims.
I mean, that's the kind of the savior complex, right? In a sense, right? And
that's
you
right.
know, the victims versus victors. I mean, I take the point really well, and I also take the point, you know, that oftentimes victims, or you know, in trafficking work we call them survivors, but they become, you know, re-traumatized through the process, right? That they become, people call them like professional witnesses. They end up staying on, and it's just becomes, you know, they are performing and re-performing their trauma, which I think probably feeds the victors, as you mentioned. So I think your point about the state, right, and how do you call a state to justice, I think is a really salient one, right? How do you call on the actions of a system and a state, and what would that look like? What would a tribunal like that look like, and how might we create mechanisms to do that? So you talk about South Africa. Let's go there. You know, you talk a lot about South Africa and the apartheid state, and you praise the student movements and the labor movements for the much needed intervention. And I think all eyes were on, you know, Rhodes Must Fall, right? That moment, that really powerful catalyzing moment for students across the globe. But you, as you stated a moment ago, they're not done. And you reference South Africa. You say that South Africa is currently a state without a nation. So can you unpack that a little bit? What do you mean, you know, being a state without a nation, and what kinds of opportunities does that present, and what kinds of challenges does that bring with it?
Thank you. Let me give one instance to clarify the point. Formal legal juridical apartheid ended in 1994 as a follow-up to the elections. During the elections, the most controversial issue was who should be allowed to vote. Only citizens or all residents in South Africa? Now, the difference was critical because South Africa was a mining, agricultural economy which attracted massive amounts of labor from across its borders. Immigrants were in not only the hundreds of thousands, millions. Immigrants were a force behind the 1970s Durban strikes, which spread from Durban right up to the Cape. Immigrants were the core of the first National Federation of Trade Unions, FOSATU, and then an important force in COSATU. So would they be allowed to vote or not, or would they be disenfranchised? This was a big question. And this was a question about what kind of state is independent South Africa going to be? Is it going to be a state of a nation whose members would be defined as citizens? And this question had several aspects to it. But what was going to be the nature of this nation? Was this going to be a black nation? The nation of the black majority, as the ANC used to say, and then stopped saying, and began to speak of not a black majority, but a non-racial democracy? Or is it going to be non-racial, but still limited to citizens, excluding all migrants? Now, in 1994, the decision was in favor of migrants. The decision respected the ringing declaration in the 1955 Freedom Charter issued by ANC, and that declaration was, South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. Not South Africa belongs to its citizens, no. South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. So that became true in 1994. But then in 1994, the Ministry of Internal Affairs was taken over by the Inkatha Freedom Party, and Gatsha Buthelezi became the Minister of Internal Affairs. And from 1994 onwards, Buthelezi and the IFP began a massive educational propaganda campaign, pitting citizens against migrants, telling citizens that if you feel you are deprived, if you feel you have not got just rewards from the struggle we fought, it is because of migrants. It is because migrants are taking a part of what should be your rightful share. And from 1994 begins what is called xenophobic violence today in South Africa. And it becomes larger and larger as the decades go on. Right? Now, the interesting thing is that this xenophobic violence in South Africa is not against whites. it's against black people from across the border. It's not against the racial stranger, it's against the tribal stranger. This speaks volumes about the challenges faced by this process, which had advanced in some ways in deracializing race, but not in deracializing tribe, because it had assumed that tribal identity was natural. It had nothing to do with colonialism. But that was not true, because whereas ethnic identity had a history long before colonialism, what was new with colonialism was the assumption that every ethnic group must have its homeland. That's the American assumption from the reservation.
Mm-hmm.
And this homeland must be run by a customary leadership with no popular accountability, enforcing a customary law, which, unlike custom historically, was no longer part of society, but was now an arm of the state, enforced by the state, and therefore which would not change.
I mean, I take that point. I mean, it's an interesting point. I would love to hear your thoughts then on, for instance, the United Arab Emirates, right? A place like Dubai, right? So you've got migrants, and you've got, I mean, you've got echoes of this here in the United States too. You've got echoes of this globally, but this sort of pitting of migrants against quote unquote citizens, right? Migrants are sort of a threat or the threat. I know that often in the UAE, well, in Dubai, let's take Dubai, 90% migrants, right? I mean, and there you've got this constant narrative of, well, they're sort of taking everything over. At the same time, that is a nation state that relies on a flexible oversupply of labor, right? I mean, and so they rely on those bodies. And at the same time, those individual migrants are not afforded any kind of sort of state participatory rights, even if and when they have, you know, had generations being born there, right? So I mean, I'd love to take your example to the UAE, right? And how might we think about that?
Look, after the Second World War, the West basically facilitated and endorsed a drawing of boundaries in the Middle East, which would put petroleum resources as much as possible on one side and large populations as much as possible on the other side, so that petroleum resources would be controlled by these mini states with hardly any population, and which would be run by mini aristocracies, incapable of standing on their own without external support. So it was a setup which could not continue without, one, external support, and two, incoming of migrants who would be perpetually considered guest workers. Think of Germany and Turks.
Right.
Think of the Indian guest workers brought into Britain. Mexican
guest workers brought into the United States. The Bracero program, yeah.
Except, as the Mexicans say, we didn't cross the border. The border
crossed them. Yeah.
Right. So, but if you look at the because all these instances have their very peculiar historical circumstance. In 1972, when we had the expulsion of Asians in Uganda, Idi Amin, and I went to a refugee camp in London, and there were strikes in Southall, and there was a writer for the New Yorker who did a long piece on it, and one of the things she uncovered was that with the tradition of strikes in Southall, there was the owner of a factory in Southall who had been a sergeant or some officer in the British Indian Army in Punjab, and he went back to find his buddies in his regiment and battalion, whatever, and he brought them in as scabs in order to break the strikes. Mm-hmm. And other factory owners followed this example. Mm-hmm. And of course, migrants were played off against workers and workers against migrants. Right. It was a two-way playing off. Right. And that's, as you say, that happens in the U.S. That happens in the Emirates. That happens in Doha. That happens everywhere. Mm-hmm. So this is. I mean, I think we've now come to the point where we have to think critically of the category citizen. Does the citizen enable or limit the exercise of rights? And I think the citizenship is problematic now because it is not completely, but it is increasingly divorced from labor. And so it enables a whole group of people to labor, but at the same time be disenfranchised under the presumption that they are not citizens. This is a big issue, I think.
And in fact, that's a version of the systemic violence that we were talking about earlier, right? That the system kind of depends on that. So we're almost out of time. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this one last question. One of the things I love about all of your work, I'm sort of going to pull back here. One of the things you inspired me to do in my own work. One of the things you do so beautifully, Professor Mamdani, is you fuse the narrative and the normative. And I love that. You use history combined with anthropology to understand contemporary politics. And you probably don't know this, but you were one of the inspirations for me to shift from being an international affairs student at SIPA to getting my PhD in anthropology at Columbia, because I loved the beautiful way that you fuse the narrative and the normative, right? So can you talk about the importance of interdisciplinarity and the importance of doing this kind of work and writing in tackling some of the world's most wicked problems?
Let me begin with an admission. I've never taken a course in anthropology, although I am a professor of anthropology at Columbia. When this job was offered to me, and I was in South Africa at the University of Cape Town, Nick Dirks was the chair of the anthropology department, and Dirks approached me with this possibility, and I said, Nick, I've never taken a course in anthropology. In fact, in Makerere, where I was, anthropology was banned as a colonial discipline. And Nick said, maybe that's why what you do is what we consider anthropology. And we want you to bring that anthropology to Columbia. And I think what he meant was that what I did was kind of interdisciplinarity. It was not just based on ethnography, but it combined ethnography, what we called fieldwork. Fieldwork was a big thing in Uganda when I was teaching at Makerere, but we combined it with history and political theory. And we did not think of political theory as they think of it within the Western Academy, which is for an individual professor to sit within his or her own study and think of the good society, work out a blueprint like Plato for his good society. We thought of political theory much more as going out to study political movements and figuring out what it is that they thought was the problem and what it is that they thought they were working towards, fully cognizant of the fact that the point was not to glamorize, romanticize what they thought, but to be prepared for the fact that whatever they thought would likely be internally contradictory, but to begin with that as the raw material. No, so we were not just journalists relaying this, but at the same time, we were not forging a blueprint. Anyway, so this particular way of doing things made me very unreceptive to the tradition of area studies in the US. When I came back to Makerere Institute of Social Research, and I began an interdisciplinary PhD program in 2010, I said to my students that we are not an area studies program. We are not studying Africa. We are studying the world from the vantage point of Africa. We do not accept that there is any universal study from a neutral vantage point, but we do accept that there are different studies of the same phenomenon from different vantage points, and we bring to it something that nobody else can, but without claiming that we bring to it everything that anybody needs. Now, so we are open to exchange, we are open to learning, but not on our knees. So this was, interdisciplinarity for me. In the US Academy, everybody supports interdisciplinarity, except the gateway is disciplinary.
Right. That's the, well, unless you're at Arizona State University, where we don't have disciplinary schools. So yeah,
Let me tell you, one of my favorite authors was at Arizona State University. He wrote The American Indian in Western Legal Thought. He's an American Indian scholar, I think in the law faculty. And I tried so hard to bring him to Columbia. So hard, he would not leave Arizona.
Because we really blew up. I mean, one of the reasons I'm here, of course, is I've been inspired by you. And I do firmly believe that you are the thought leader of true interdisciplinary work. And that is the kind of work that we actually need in the world today. That is the way higher ed lives out its mission. And so for me, I ended up at Arizona State University because it is a place that lives that value of, I'm the director of a school called the School of Social Transformation. We have people with PhDs in as many disciplines as you can think of. We're all working on social transformation. But I really believe that you are a legend, and you are such a pivotal point in transforming epistemology. And I know that your work has been on systemic violence, but I want to say that you have been a transformational figure in combating epistemic violence. So I want to thank you for that, for inspiring me and for inspiring so many people. And thank you so much to the Jaipur Literature Festival for allowing us to have this conversation, which could have gone on for hours. Very much a pleasure to speak with you, Professor Mamdani. Sanjoy, I turn it back to you.
Pardis, you have been extraordinarily generous. Thank you so much. I'm not used to hearing all these things, and I assure you that they will not just stay in my head. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for wonderful work. Thank you. Bye.
Professor Mamdani, Pardis Mahdavi, what a fascinating conversation. And as Pardis said, this could have carried on forever. We need to get you both back. This is a fascinating piece of work, especially when you're looking at violence and the fact that what Professor Mamdani said, that extreme violence is not a one-off act. And in fact, extreme violence is always reproduced. And much more on that. I wish we could continue this as a series, which we hope to do. But thank you both. Thank you for that absolutely fascinating conversation on everything from America and how the nation state behaved there, and how Hitler looked at the citizenship program from there and took it on. Just absolutely fascinating. Please do remain logged on for our next session, Born a Muslim, the Population Myth. S.Y. Qureshi, Ghazala Wahab in conversation with Pragya Tiwari. Do remember, in our efforts to rebuild the arts sector impacted by the second wave, Teamwork Arts has launched, I believe, Art Matters Part 2. In our first version, we supported 5,200 artists in need of food and rations, of just sustenance, because as you all know, if an artist does not perform, if an artisan does not sell his or her wares, well, they don't eat at the end of the day. Do help by donating to the cause. We have thousands of mouths to feed across the length and breadth of the country. So please do press donate at the bottom of the screen. Meanwhile, thank you all for watching. Stay tuned. See you at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time shortly.
In these times during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई एक सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information.